Before Athens became the seat of philosophy and thought and higher learning in the world, before the Parthenon was built, Athens was just a small city-state in the mainland off of the Mediterranean Sea. And it was a small city with a small group of people, but it was the first democracy that the world had ever seen. It was a small state, a small city that was ruled democratically. And within the realm of Athens, they had found a large deposit of silver. And it was worth an awful lot of money. And they mined this silver and got the treasure from it. And the matter of what to do with this great treasure came before the people of Athens. And there were lots of ideas about what to do with the silver. Some people thought that it should be used in the building of structures and perhaps statues or monuments. Some people thought that it could be divvied up amongst all the people and so forth. Lots of debate. But there was in the city of Athens at the time a man by the name of Themistocles. And Themistocles was a man of real good forethought and foresight. He had an idea of what to use the money for. He was concerned that as Athens grew in wealth and grew in prosperity, that it was going to be ripe for the picking of one of the great empires and world forces of the day. And the great empire of the day was the Persian Empire, led by Xerxes. And Themistocles made the argument that Athens was totally unable to defend itself, and that the whole proceeds of this silver treasure should be spent in building triremes. Triremes were boats that were not made for transport or hauling or anything. They were just war boats. They were very slender, quick boats with 3 levels of oarsmen, 170 on each level. And they were fitted at the front with a steel cast iron buttress that would just be used to ram ships. And they were so fast, so quick, that they could go and ram a ship and sink it. Well, he was successful in making this argument. Well, to make a long story short, very long story, Xerxes did eventually come to claim Athens. And he was able, with his ground forces, to march right into Athens and to take the city. But Themistocles had the entire people of Athens, almost every single man had to go to man these boats. And they all got into these boats, and as the major force of Xerxes' army came by boat, they sailed right into the Salamis Straits, right by Athens, where there was no room to maneuver. And out of nowhere, these 200 trireme boats, which are very expensive, came out of nowhere and sank and destroyed almost the entire Persian fleet. And Xerxes and the Persian army had to retreat back to the Middle East. Now, I tell you that story to say that this shows the value of understanding. It shows the value of wisdom. It shows the value of knowledge. And I want you to understand today that as a church, we have a treasure far greater than that of silver and gold. We have been entrusted with the greatest treasure in the earth, which is knowledge of God, which is the character of God, the law. And we have a much fiercer enemy than the Athenians had in Xerxes, for we have an enemy in Satan. And really, God's people at every turn and throughout its entire history have had better apologists than Themistocles. God has always blessed his people with prophets and preachers and people who could adequately explain to the people the knowledge and the truth and the wisdom of God. So my question is this to you today. If that's the case, if we have a greater treasure, a greater enemy, and greater apologists for God's truth and wisdom, why is it then that the church is visited almost throughout its entire history with struggle and failure and reversals? Why is that the case? And why is that the case today? I really believe that every ebb in the church's tide throughout all of history is directly attributable to ignorance. Anywhere where the tide of the church has ebbed and waned and fallen and backslidden, I believe it's always attributable to one simple reality, and that's ignorance. John Lively said, it is a blind goose that cometh to a fox's sermon. And that's what you have. We have been beguiled by the sermons of false teachers because we've been blind. And we haven't been able to come against it. You know, in World War II, freedom and liberty was under attack. And the leaders of our country and other freedom-loving countries identified our enemy as the axis of tyranny. And the Axis powers, of course, as many of you remember, were Germany, Italy, and Japan. And tyranny was a line, and around that line rotated these Axis powers. Well, I believe today that our enemy, the church is under attack today as well, and we're trying to defend the cause of Christ and his kingdom against ignorance. And I believe that the axis of ignorance, the Axis powers, are those of doubt, lust, and independence. That the chief contributing forces which have to be overthrown, if ignorance is to be overthrown, and for wisdom to once again reign in the church and to reign in our day, we have to defeat, just as Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin had to overthrow Germany, Italy, and Japan. We as the church today, we are going to have to overthrow doubt, we're going to have to overthrow lust, and we're going to have to overthrow independence if wisdom and truth are going to reign the day again. Alfred North Whitehead is famous for saying that not ignorance, but ignorance of ignorance is the death of knowledge. And he's right. Knowledge does not, it's not that ignorance is the death of knowledge, but ignorance of ignorance. If you know you're ignorant today, you can gain knowledge. But what's more dangerous than not even knowing that you're ignorant? And I think that's chiefly my concern with the church today, that it's sleepwalking. It's blind and doesn't know it. And it's ignorant and doesn't know it. And so part of my hope today, by looking at this conversation that God had with one of his prophets about the people who were ignorant, is to maybe for us identify those things in us which are keeping us ignorant today. And so we're going to look at these three different Axis powers and see how we might overthrow them. Okay? The first Axis power that I think is identified by God here in this conversation with Ezekiel is that of doubt. So let's look again at the 30th verse of our text here today. Ezekiel chapter 33, verse 30. Here, God says, "But as for you, son of man, your fellow citizens who talk about you by the walls and in the doorways of the houses speak to one another, each to his brother, saying, 'Come now, and hear what the message is which comes from the Lord.'" Listen, the earth doesn't shake every time the Lord talks. I think we have a picture of Ezekiel. We think of Ezekiel in our mind's eye. We picture him as a wizened old man, right? With eyes of steel and a beard of white and a voice like thunder. And whenever he comes down to speak to the people, he comes down off of a high hill in a cloud, and he raises his staff above his head, and he proclaims mightily, right? Well, that's not so. That's not what Ezekiel was like. In fact, Ezekiel was a young man, married, and he lived in Tel Aviv, in Babylon, by the river Kibar, by the river. Lived in a small house by the river. Ezekiel was a young man when he was taken into slavery, into captivity. He was taken into captivity into Babylon, and after he was in captivity, he got married. And 5 years after he was a slave, he accepted the calling from the Lord. And so you have to picture here that Ezekiel is no great personality with no great arena in which to speak. He does not have. He's just a regular guy who very regularly hosts people who come to his house to hear from the Lord. He's somebody who claims to have been called of the Lord to speak on his behalf to the people, and regularly he holds court in his own house, and anybody who wants to come to hear him can come to hear him. And you get the idea here when God is speaking to Ezekiel that he's saying to the people, he says, "Do you understand, Ezekiel, that the people who come to hear you, they're talking about you behind your back.